The 2008 home invasion film The Strangers is widely considered to be one of the best in the genre. Writer-director Bryan Bertino approached the material through the lens of suspense films from the 70s, and with Rennie Harlin's upcoming first chapter in his trilogy of prequels to that original, I thought what better time than now to take a look at where it all started. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. Well, surprise, surprise, we've got another Legacy sequel coming up in just a little while now. Sort of. It's a prequel to The Strangers, but what's interesting about this is that this upcoming trilogy is apparently all releasing before the end of this year, which is a pretty wild approach to this sort of thing. I hadn't seen The Strangers for a long time, so going into this, I wasn't entirely sure where I'd stand on it. Bertino's work has made an appearance on this channel before. Like way before, further, all the way back to the very first review on this channel. The Dark and the Wicked is the first video on Rocklin Graves, so it's kind of cool to be circling around and taking a look at another film from the dude who made the first movie I covered. By the way, if for some reason you still haven't seen The Dark and the Wicked, for the love of God, watch it, it's great. Anyway, we're not talking about The Dark and the Wicked today. We're talking about Bertino's directorial debut, which interestingly enough, he'd never actually planned on directing. He wrote the screenplay inspired by a knock at the door of his childhood house, which was answered by his little sister while his parents were out. There was a woman asking for someone who didn't live at the house, and they found out later on that there was a group of people with her that were breaking into the houses where no one answered the door. Bertino wound up selling the script to Universal and was then completely disconnected from the project, but after 2 directors dropped off, Universal gave the rights to Rough Pictures, a subsidiary company who then approached Bertino to direct his screenplay, to which he agreed. Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman were cast in the lead roles, with Gemma Ward, Kip Weeks, and Laura Margoli being cast as the masked stalkers. The film was made for $9 million and made roughly $83 million globally at the box office, and up until now there was only one sequel, but we're gonna save that for next time. For now, let's take a look at one of the biggest poster children for the home invasion genre. Before that though, I want to thank my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. These videos take a lot of time and energy to make, and the extra support really helps to keep things moving. If you're interested in getting some bonus material and accessing private supporter-only polls or getting early access to the big videos, consider supporting me on either platform.
Is Tamara here?
No.
One of the biggest defining qualities of The Strangers is the sense of immersion that's established right from the start, which is a very important thing to accomplish when making a home invasion movie. Because it's one of the more grounded horror concepts, pulling the viewer into the world matters a lot. We're introduced to James Hoyt and Kristen McKay as they're arriving at James's family's summer home after a wedding. Unless you're still annually buying Madden, you'll probably notice that there's some tension between the two. We're catching up with them right after a botched proposal at the wedding they were at, and there's so much to how Bertino lets the situation play out that makes it really work. Not revealing right away what happened is a great way to hook the audience in, and once we find out about what happened, all of the preparations that James set up ahead of time and excitement for what he'd assumed would be the most romantic night of their lives becomes really damn depressing. I also like that their dynamic isn't hostile and is instead very solemn and heartbroken. They're clearly still in love, but have hit a really big roadblock and they're not sure what it means for them going forward. This movie has a structure that relies heavily on this opening establishment of their relationship, because once things get bad, it essentially turns into a very long chase sequence with little else in the way of narrative progression, which means making us care about these two is really important so that the movie doesn't get boring. What it feels like is that we have this first act that's slower paced and really takes its time to set up the necessities. Then there's a very short second act where James isn't convinced of the threat, which I'm going to get into in a moment because I have some gripes about how his character is handled. And then it's like over half of the movie is the third act. Because of that, we really need to get invested in Kristen and James, otherwise the whole thing is going to fall apart. Thankfully, all of the time we spend with them is used wonderfully, giving us a very realistic portrayal of what a relationship that's just been hit with something like this looks like. You just can't help but sympathize with where they're at and feel everything they're feeling. Little moments like them passing this champagne bottle between the two of them and taking huge swigs as they both realize that they're sort of on their own in this, since they're dealing with two opposite sides of an issue, but want to try and help each other out in that solitude. The whole thing is just heartbreaking, and it's so gripping that By the time the strangers showed up, I actually forgot I was watching a horror movie and not just a really good single location drama. And I was also reminded that Bertino likes to do horrible things to his characters, so my heart started to sink ever deeper into my chest. It's this setup of these two characters that I think separates the strangers from what could have been a standard home invasion flick, giving us this emotionally evocative story to start the movie off with, and then introducing this threat before the problems between James and Kristen have been resolved adds a whole new layer of tragedy to the ensuing attack on them, especially when we see the bond between them that took this huge hit as they fight together and try and protect each other. The movie can be an emotional gut punch with the way it sets up this story that you really want to see get resolved between these two, because there are so many unsaid things between them, but they never get a chance to take that step. Bryan Bertino, you are a cruel, cruel man. I know it probably seems like I'm spending a long time talking about the couple when the vast majority of this movie is fully focused on the home invasion stuff, but I think that the way this setup is handled is so important to making this movie work as well as it does, both from an emotional standpoint, but also from the sense of immersion that this creates. The short time we spend with the two of them before things get bad are handled in a very realistic way, so when you get drawn into the immersion of the movie and get invested in the world, the transition into the horror side of things is able to ride off of that sense of realism, which elevates the tension of the movie tenfold. Another way that this setup affects the overall feel of the movie is by elevating the invasive nature of what's going on. A home invasion movie ideally will create a strong sense of privacy and personality in the home before bringing the threat into play to make the attack feel more invasive. And while this isn't their actual home, building up that connection between them fills in those blanks well enough and creates this strong feeling of privacy and intimacy between them. Having the first visit from one of the villains interrupt when things are getting especially intimate is a great way to create that vibe of an attack on what should be a completely private time and place. This sort of thing is commonplace in horror, of course, but I think it especially works for a home invasion movie since it establishes that intimacy with the space that the characters are occupying, hence making the movie feel more believable and elevating the tension. Of course, it also helps a fair bit that the villains in this movie are scary as all hell. We're first introduced to them when a knock at the door interrupts some fervorous confusion sex, and this is where Bertino translates that really creepy childhood memory into film.
Is Tamara here?
No.
The way this movie slowly ramps up over the course of the next little while is so good, and this being our introduction to the threat at hand makes for a really creepy feeling right away. I love that detail of her having to unscrew the light bulb before coming up to the door so her face is engulfed in darkness. The way she pauses for too long between questions and answers is really eerie, like she's giving them an ocular pat down and scoping the place out. Things are quiet for a while, but when James leaves to go buy Kristen more cigarettes and go for one of those contemplative night drives, things start to slowly escalate, and this section is where Bertino's understanding of building suspense and his inspiration from 70s horror really shines. One of my favorite things about this slow burn is how Kristen is under the impression that what she's currently doing is trying to keep things locked down and stop these people from getting into the house. And when it's revealed to the audience, but not to her, that they already found a way in, this whole new layer is added to the movie where Kristen is even more vulnerable than she realizes. It's made worse by the fact that even though they're already inside, they don't actually make any moves yet. The guy just stands back there staring at her, emphasizing how they're not just here to attack them, they're viewing this as a sort of game that they don't want to be over yet. To me, the villains in this movie are some of the scariest in the genre because of the synergy that comes when the movie sucks you into this very grounded world and then introduces these really disturbed, sick people who treat this whole thing like a fun game of hide and seek. It's extremely creepy for a while, and by the end, it's just downright upsetting and deeply disturbing, but we'll get into that in a bit. These bastards are really creepy and quickly become extremely intimidating because once they see that the game can begin, they just start firing on all cylinders and commence this onslaught of horror. The camera work in this movie is really great, shooting basically entirely handheld in another show of inspiration from 70s horror. I love how the strangers are kept at a distance for a while before we get a good close-up look at them, and it's a while longer after that before we see them clearly for any extended period of time. There's a lot of unknown with these killers, and shooting them in this very distant, out-of-focus way is really effective for emphasizing that mystery. Well, I think lighting is often the thing that grabs my attention the most from the technical side of filmmaking. The best part about the cinematography in this movie is the framing, and this shot is a great example of those peaks. The technical side of this movie is handled so well. This sequence where Kristen is being attacked before James gets home is genuinely one of the most tense, suspenseful, and dreadful sequences I've seen. We follow along in real time as things escalate at a horrifying rate, from another knock at the door to a bag-headed killer staring at her right outside the window. It feels all too real thanks to the performance from Liv Tyler and the immersive camera work, and there's a great addition to this whole thing that amplifies the unsettling feeling of it. There's a record that's playing that ends up skipping over and over again, resulting in a very sadistic and dizzying soundtrack to the moments before James gets home. As far as home invasion horror scenes go, this honestly may be my favorite in any movie. It just feels start to finish so viscerally terrifying and immersive. So as I was saying earlier, The Strangers has a somewhat unique structure to it, where we get this time to set up the two main characters and suck us into the world, and then there's this quiet build-up before the explosion comes, and that lasts really until the very end. While I basically have no complaints about the sequences setting up James and Kristen, as well as the first onslaught directed at Kristen before James comes back from buying cigarettes, the movie unfortunately runs into some issues that kind of undo a lot of the immersion that was so well built up earlier on. The biggest roadblock that hurts this movie is the decision making during the second act, particularly from James. I've said this before, but I wholly reject the idea that bad decision making in horror movies is inevitable. If your characters make more believable and therefore relatable decisions, then whatever horror follows is going to be a lot more impactful because it feels more tangible that the characters would end up in the situation they find themselves in as a result of the decisions they made. That makes it so that you go, that's what I would do, and it still didn't work out, and that's scarier. When James comes home to find Kristen locked in the bedroom, shaking in terror with a substantial cut, and she says that there are masked people attacking her, and then his response is to look down the hall and say this:
No one out here. Nobody, come here.
You've lost me. That right there drains so much of the immersion that's felt following the great setup, and it's unfortunately not the only example of this sort of thing. Why in God's name would James think that Kristen is lying about this? Well, it's really frustrating to see how seemingly chill he is about what's going on. His character becomes nearly infuriating when he actually sees these masked stalkers around the house and still doesn't take this as a genuine threat.
You want me to go talk to her?
He just keeps going on acting like they can't touch him, and what makes the way he's handled here feel so baffling is that his stupid decision-making isn't even a contrivance to get him and Kristen into any situation. His lack of worry doesn't result in them being in a different position than they would be if he'd listened to her right away and had even a little bit of stranger danger reflex in him. When they try and drive off after way too long of him just going along like this isn't a big deal, one of the strangers smashes his truck into James's car and then immediately gives up on trying to drive away and run back into the house. They could have avoided doing so much damage to the engagement set up earlier on if James hadn't been so airheaded out of absolutely nowhere. If he'd come back and found Kristen in this state, heard what she had to say, and then they decided to just leave right away, the tires could have been slashed or the truck could have come and hit them then, and we wouldn't have this really annoying period of the kind of decision making that gives horror a bad reputation a lot of the time.
One of them came in here and took my phone.
Kristen, nobody came in here.
While I don't agree that poor decision-making is just an inevitable element of all horror movies, it's certainly a part of some genres and in some cases can be charming. But for a home invasion movie, it feels like this directly goes against the point. These are supposed to be more believable and tangible movies that you can place yourself in and elevate the tension through that. Granted, replacing this sequence wouldn't eliminate all of the frustrating decision-making because there's one moment later on that almost entirely ruins any actual suspense the movie built up. When James and Kristen first arrived at the vacation home, James called his brother Mike to come and pick him up after the proposal went south, and Mike shows up earlier than anticipated because he didn't want to leave James in this awkward situation. That's a nice character detail, I appreciate that. We're building up some good emotional stakes here. Now there is a bit of a split experience with this plot point because on the one hand, it results in one of the best moments of the entire movie when James blasts Mike with a shotgun thinking he's one of the strangers, and then the slow realization comes of just what happened. It's a massive gut punch in a story that just keeps breaking our hearts, and it's acted absolutely wonderfully by Scott Speedman and Liv Tyler. The punchline of this scene is incredible, but it's the stuff that builds up to the gun going off that makes it a little tougher to fully feel the weight of it. When Mike arrives, the house is in disarray, and it's clear something's wrong. Not just that, it's clear that he knows something's wrong, and there's an incredibly infuriating sequence where he's slowly walking down the hallway looking for James or Kristen, and he's checking around every corner, very clearly aware that there might have been a break-in. But he never thinks to just turn around for a second. It's like the oldest thing in horror. Fucking turn around. It's really annoying to see someone be this cautious while they navigate, but never bother to check the one very obvious spot where the killer would be. If you're being this careful, you turn around at least once or twice. There's a lot that I really like about this movie, and that it does very well, but I've always found the middle section can drag pretty heavily. Partially because it's just a really long chase sequence, but also because it only focuses on two people who survive most of the runtime. You don't have any real significant events come up aside from Mike's death. I'm not saying I want this to be a slasher movie, because I understand that the focus is more on suspense here, but I don't find it very suspenseful to go through the loop of hiding, then being found, then running and hiding a few times over, especially not when so much of the immersion I had was broken apart by the really contrived decision making. I don't think this would drag as much for me if the characters felt more realistic by this point. It's definitely helped by the teamwork between James and Kristen, as well as the performances from both parties, but especially once they get separated, I find the movie just drags for a while and I feel like I'm just biding time until the end. The ending of The Strangers is one of the bleaker conclusions out there, and especially with the way James and Kristen are set up in a pretty sympathetic and relatable way, it's a real gut punch. It also comes with one of the most chilling lines in all of horror.
Why are you doing this to us?
Because you were home.
All of that emotion that was set up earlier on comes back in full force one last time in this ending that feels way too real to be comfortable sitting through, as the two are forced to accept what's happening and try to hold on to each other for their final moments. This is genuinely difficult to watch. This scene being bathed in what's usually the comforting glow of the sun after a horrifying night in a horror movie gives it such a sickly and uncaring feel to it, and I honestly think it's one of the things that makes these villains feel genuinely frightening. It's an eerie image to see that morning light illuminate these poor people being tied up and murdered brutally. Such a blunt and unsettling way to close things off. James is killed, and while it looks like Kristen is at first, she tries to make an attempt to crawl towards Mark's ringing phone in the unrated cut, but she's stopped before she can. When some kids later stumble onto the scene after a thankfully brief and uneventful interaction with the strangers, the movie closes off by revealing that Kristen is still alive after all. Now, whether or not she can actually survive these injuries is another question entirely, but leaving that up in the air at least gives something to grasp onto here for like a sliver of hope in what's overall a harrowing conclusion to this story.
Can I have one?
Are you a sinner?
Sometimes.
We close off knowing nothing about the strangers themselves, which is absolutely the right move to make for this one. Adding any motive whatsoever to them beyond
Because you were home.
will take away not just from the mystique of them as killers, but also from the impact of the entire movie. It's the senselessness of it that makes this so tangible, because when there's no motive, you might find yourself getting creeped out next time there's a knock at your door. I also love the moment where the two boys bump into them, because while we don't see the strangers close up, and I don't want to here, they just look like perfectly normal people. Dollface is out smoking a dart, Baghead is just chilling in the front seat, and she's here talking to these kids in broad daylight, and this is moments after committing that horrific act we just witnessed. This is the scariest possible way to send these killers off, because while the setup of the movie and the senselessness of the killings can ground the victims in reality, this scene does the incredibly important task of grounding the villains in everyday life. It's an absolutely chilling bow to tie this movie off with, showing these sadistic bastards in a light that just looks like some normal people you'd see throughout the day. The Strangers is an incredibly simple concept that is overall executed very well, save for the middle section of the movie that I don't personally find as interesting or engaging as the opening buildup of the relationship between Kristen and James, or the really disturbing final scene. The absolutely callous villains are such horrifying and grounded antagonists that are shot expertly and feel like a genuine threat, although the contrived, stupid decision-making at moments takes away from some of the impact of the things that happen as a result of them. That aside though, this is one of the best home invasion movies ever made, without question, despite some of its shortcomings, thanks to how realistic it often feels. It's a very grounded and disturbing portrayal of a senseless attack, and for that, it more than earns its reputation. Next up, I'll be taking a look at the 2003 remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, since the 50th anniversary of the original film is coming up soon, and I want to touch on some of the franchise before then. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.